Hey, welcome back to my channel. My name is Bridget and I'm an artist and art educator. In this video tutorial, I'll be showing you how to make a watercolor bouquet. So I begin by drawing where I want the piece to be on the page. I'm figuring out how big I want it to be and where I want it to fit within the frame of the page. I'm using a pencil to sketch out very lightly where I want everything to be. And for this pencil sketch, I'm only focusing on outlines and keeping my lines clean. I'm trying not to make them too sketchy and I'm trying not to do any shading. I'm gonna leave all of that up to the watercolor when I go and add it later. So within this larger circle that I drew to outline where I want the whole bouquet to fit, I'm going in and I'm drawing each individual flower. To begin each flower, I start off with the outside petals. I find that it's a lot easier to start from the outside of the flower and work my way towards the inside, rather than from the inside and working my way out. This way I can control how big the flower is and control how fine the details will be. Again, I'm focusing on just the outline of each petal. I'm only putting the bare necessities here. I'm not going in with any shading or any fine line details because I'm going to do that later with the color of the watercolor. It's also important to pay attention to which lines you want to keep and which lines you want to erase, because once you add the watercolor on top, you will not be able to erase the pencil. So pay attention to that as you draw yours. And make sure to erase anything that you don't want before you add your watercolor. As I'm drawing, it's important to know that I'm not just making up these flowers. I'm actually using a reference photo, so that way I know exactly how the petals lay, and then my flowers can look more realistic at the end. And I'm taking my time here. I'm not doing anything in a rush, and then that way I know I can get the petals looking exactly how I want them. This pre-drawing is helpful for the final results, so don't rush through it, go slow, take your time, pay attention to the details that you add and the shapes that you make. Again, here you can see that I'm starting with the outside petals before I do the inside petals. I'm keeping my lines clean and simple. I'm going slow as I continually check my reference photo to make sure that I'm keeping in line with it. So the shapes that I'm drawing are not shapes that we have names for, and so they're a little bit more complicated to draw than just your standard, circle, triangle, square. So that's why it's important to really look at your reference photo and pay attention to how those lines go, and try not to make things up. Try to just trust your eyes, trust what they see, and that way you will create something that's more true to life. Again, I'm trying to keep the shapes as simple as possible, as clean as possible. I'm not worrying about any details. I'm just trying to get those forms down on the paper. That way I can more accurately add the watercolor. And I'm starting with the bigger flowers first before I move on to these smaller flowers. That way I can get those bigger shapes down and then use the smaller flowers to sort of fill in the gaps that are left behind. Now, as you can see, I've used this picture-in-picture effect, so that way you can see the close-up of what I am doing. I hope that you can learn from the lines that I make and how I go about drawing my flower. As you can see, I am being very slow and very careful and very intentional about it. So I hope that you take that same care in your own flowers as well, especially if you are not super familiar with how flowers are, what their forms are like, what their leaves are like. It's important to go slow. In fact, I would even practice the flowers on a separate piece of paper before you even start, if that's something that you are worried about. But pay attention to whatever reference photo you have. Every flower is going to look a little bit different, but also know that it's okay if your flowers do not match exactly what your flowers look like in your reference, because we're not making super scientific paintings here. We are just making some beautiful art, and art does not have to look 100% perfect or 100% accurate to what you see. Art is something more. It's something much more life-giving, something beautiful. It's an interpretation, so you don't have to be super precise with it. I mean, you're totally welcome to if that's what you like, but don't get too hung up on that. It's all about what it looks like all together. And it's about how it makes you feel. How does it make you feel when you are drawing it? How does it make you feel when you're painting it? How does it make you feel when you're looking at it at the end? Really, it comes down to what you like and what your preferences are. So don't be too fussed about the things that you don't want to be fussed about. For this succulent in the bouquet, I'm starting with the bottom petals and then working my way to the top petals. It's similar to working from the outside and working my way in. I'm working from the bottom and working my way up because to me, that's just what makes sense. Each petals are layered on top of the other. So that's why I start with the bottom ones. So now I'm starting the flower right next to this succulent, and this flower has really big petals, which is really good for the composition. When you have a really small detailed space, sometimes it's nice to balance it out with more negative space. So think bigger shapes and more negative space to give the eye a rest. Now, what I've learned drawing these crinkly flower petal shapes is that there are a lot of wide U shapes as well as, the open bracket or the closed bracket, the curly one. There's a few of those shapes in it too. So if you like, you can practice making some of those on another sheet of paper, and that way you can get really good at getting the proportions right for the petals. So now I'm just going to speed up the footage because I'm just doing the same things but with a variety of different flowers. So I hope that you can take the skills that I've taught you and apply it to any flower that you want to draw. I'm also taking this time to tidy up my edges before the watercolor. So what I always tell my students for watercolor is that instead of digging into the paint, as most watercolors come dry, what you do is you create a puddle. Or even if your watercolor comes from a tube, the color goes such a long way. So make sure that you are first creating a little puddle to draw from, and then that way you can also build layers. You can start off light and then gradually add layers and create the shading that you want, and it'll make a much more dynamic piece, just a lot more depth to your piece. So for the paper that the bag is in, I've used some burnt sienna, and then for these initial leaves here that I have the greenery throughout the bouquet, I have just made a really blue-green. So I've used some green, I've added some blue to it, maybe a little bit of that burnt sienna just to give it a little bit of a darker tone. And now I'm using almost like a lime green. So I've created a light green using a little bit of blue and a lot of yellow to give that bright green effect. And the colors I'm using, I'm following my reference photo as well as paying attention to what colors I think might look together and where. So I like to have a variety of greens in my bouquets as well as, pinks or whatever other colors, just to give the piece more visual interest. Now the main flowers in this bouquet happen to be white, and you'll see the tricks that I'm going to use to give the illusion that the flowers are white, because we can't just leave them blank without any paint on them, right? So the trick is that we go in with other colors very subtle in the shadows of the flower, and we leave most of the flower white like the paper. But as you can see, so I'm starting with a little bit of very, very, very light burnt sienna, and I'm going into the middle of the flower first, and then I'm taking some blue for the shadows of the flower. Now the flower from my reference photo, they have that sort of warm, bright, burnt sienna look to them in the middle, and then the shadows happen to be cooler, a little bit darker, and so I've used some blue for that, some very watered down, very light blue, because the flowers are still white. So we just want to trick the eye into believing that the flower is white using color. And as with every watercolor painting that you'll do, it's easiest to start off with lighter colors and work your way to darker, rather than darkest colors working your way lighter. It doesn't quite work with watercolor. So I'm starting with my lightest colors first. And you'll notice that I'm leaving a lot of white space in between each of the petals that I'm working with if I do not want the colors to mix. It's important to work in sections if you do not want your colors to mix. But if you do want your colors to mix, then you can paint right next to whatever color is there and it won't matter. But if you want to keep your colors separate, it's important to work in sections. So you can start at the top and then move down to the bottom and then the middle, or you can start on the bottom and work your way to the right, or what have you. But it's important to leave that space and wait for your first colors to dry before adding any other colors if you don't want them to mix. And once my first colors are dry, I can go back in and paint beside them, and I don't have to worry about the colors mixing. And for the stems at the bottom of the bouquet, I'm not going to worry about keeping my colors separate. So I just painted the different greens right beside each other and they can blend, and I'm not even going to worry about it. So now I'm starting to go in with my darkest colors. So like my darkest greens and my shadows. And that way I don't have to worry about trying to make the piece lighter. Instead, I'm just worrying about contrast now. Contrast is when you have dark darks and light lights, and it just really makes your painting pop. So for the darkest parts, I've taken some black and I've added some blue, just because black straight from the tube doesn't look as nice as like a black that you've made yourself. And I've diluted it a little bit with some water, and that way it won't create such harsh shadows, but give sort of a more realistic look. So for the shadows of the original greenery that I did, I'm taking that same blue-green, but I've added a little bit of black to it just to make it a little bit darker, but not by much. I want to give very soft shadows, and I'm putting them wherever the shadows would be naturally, so around the tip and towards the bottom, just to give it a more realistic effect. And once my paint is dry, I'm taking a fine tip pen and just outlining some of those details that I really want to pop, such as the paper bag and the stems of the flowers. And there you have it, one watercolor bouquet. I hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial. Please leave a like, a comment, and let me know if you have any questions or what you want to see next. And feel free to follow me on my socials. You can see I'm Art with Bridget on Pinterest and TikTok and Instagram. And if you like this piece or any others on my channel, quite often they're available on my website, so check it out. Thanks for watching.